You have no memory of being born, of speaking your first word, of taking your first step, or of the first moment someone held you and you gazed up into their face. You have no memory of learning what a dog was, of tasting something sweet for the first time, or of realizing that your own hands belong to you. Yet all of that actually took place. You were present for it. You were awake and aware, taking in feelings and experiences, absorbing a brand new world at an incredible pace. And then all of it disappeared. For nearly everyone, everything before around the age of 3 simply isn't there anymore. A few people retain a scattered fragment from age 4, maybe a birthday, a ride in a car, a particular smell. But the earliest years of life, the stretch when your brain grows and learns more dramatically than at any other time, exist as almost total silence. No recollections at all, nothing to draw on. So where does it all go? This isn't ordinary forgetfulness, like misplacing your keys. It's a thorough, nearly complete wiping away of the opening chapter of your life. For a long stretch of time, science had no solid explanation for why this happens. Now, though, we have some answers, and they're genuinely interesting. Let's begin with the obvious question. Were you even conscious during that time? Was there really anything happening worth holding on to? The answer is yes, without question. Babies aren't just soaking up sensations passively. From very early on, they're active, curious, and emotionally reactive. A newborn can pick out their mother's voice within hours of being born, because they heard it already while in the womb, and that sound was already stored in memory before they ever opened their eyes to daylight. Within just days, babies start showing preferences, reacting differently to familiar faces compared to unfamiliar ones. Their cries even differ depending on whether they're hungry, in pain, or lonely. There is unmistakably someone present, a genuine conscious being having real experiences from the start. And still, none of it remains in a way you can reach now. The first real clue to solving this mystery comes from examining what memory actually is and how it forms in the first place. Memory is not like hitting record on a camera, and understanding this is essential, even though it goes against how most people assume the brain works. When something happens to you, your brain doesn't simply capture it like a video file to be stored away. What actually happens is much messier and much more complex than that. Different elements of a single experience get handled by different regions of the brain, all at the same time. The emotional side gets processed in one place, the sensory details in another, and the order of events, the actual storyline of what occurred, is handled somewhere else entirely. For you to end up with a memory you can consciously retrieve later, the kind where you can say, I was there and this happened to me, all those separate pieces need to come together and get locked into one stable, retrievable unit. That linking process depends on a specific part of the brain known as the hippocampus. Think of the hippocampus as the brain's filing system for memory, the structure responsible for pulling together the scattered fragments of an experience into one coherent whole that can be stored and later found again. Without the hippocampus doing its job, you might still process something and even be emotionally affected by it, but you won't end up with a conscious, story-like memory that you can intentionally call back up. And here's the crucial part. In infants, the hippocampus is nowhere near fully developed. It's not just a little behind or nearly there. It's substantially incomplete, still functionally immature during the first years of life. The neurons themselves exist, but the dense web of connections between them, the network needed for efficient storage and retrieval of memories, simply hasn't been built yet. The hippocampus goes through major development across the first 2 to 3 years of life, and certain areas of it keep developing all the way into the teenage years. So when a baby goes through something wonderful, or scary, or joyful, it's a bit like trying to film video on a camera that has no memory card inside it yet. The lens works fine, the processor is functioning, but there's simply no place for the recording to be stored. That's why the memories never get formed to begin with. Not in any lasting, story-based way. Not the kind you could revisit decades down the road. That's only part of the explanation, though, because it still doesn't account for why most people can't recall anything from age 2 or 3 either, even though by then the hippocampus has developed considerably more than it had at birth. This is where the story gets more complicated. There's a second factor at play, and it involves something called neurogenesis. Your brain keeps producing new neurons across your entire lifetime. For a long time, this idea was considered fringe science. The old belief was that you were born with a fixed number of neurons, and that number never changed. That belief has since been disproven. New neurons continue to be generated, especially within the hippocampus. Here's the twist. During early childhood, the pace at which new neurons appear in the hippocampus is remarkably high, far exceeding the rate seen at any later stage of life. An infant's brain is churning out new hippocampal neurons at a speed that adult brains simply never reach again. And every one of those newly formed neurons has to be woven into the brain's existing network. Each one needs to locate its position, establish links, and become wired into the overall system. That process of integration is inherently disruptive. It shakes up connections that were already there, effectively reshuffling the filing system as it goes. Picture it this way. Imagine a library that isn't old and orderly, but young and chaotic, one that's adding hundreds of new shelves daily. Books keep arriving faster than anyone can properly catalog them. The organizational scheme is constantly shifting as new sections get built out. Books you placed somewhere don't necessarily stay put because the shelves themselves are always being rearranged. That's essentially what's happening inside a young child's hippocampus. The very quality that makes the infant brain so remarkably efficient at learning, that explosive burst of growth and constant generation of fresh neurons, is at the same time what makes it nearly impossible to build stable, long-lasting memories. Rapid neuron production essentially sacrifices memory storage in favor of maximizing learning capacity. The infant brain is built to soak up new information as fast as possible, not to archive it in a form that will still be reachable decades later. You were absorbing information faster than any adult ever could, and the price for that speed was losing all of it afterward. But there's a third piece to this puzzle, and it might be the strangest one yet: language. On the surface, this seems obvious. Of course, babies can't form memories in words since they haven't learned any words yet. But the connection runs much deeper than that, because the link between language and memory is far more fundamental than most people assume. Autobiographical memory, the kind where you can say, "I remember when I was 5 and this happened," is structurally tied to language itself. It's not only that you need words to describe your memories to someone else. The very internal act of experiencing a memory, of replaying it in your head, of recognizing that it happened to you specifically and not to someone else, that entire process is shaped by language in ways that are difficult to fully untangle. When you recall something, you're partly narrating it to yourself in that moment. You're building a story, arranging a sequence of events, forming a sense of yourself moving through time. And that capacity to build a narrative, to place yourself as the main character in a story, develops in tandem with language itself. Infants do have a sense of self. Research has confirmed this much. But it's a sense of self rooted entirely in the present moment. An "I am experiencing this right now" kind of awareness. Extending that awareness backward in time, into a personal history you can retrieve later, the autobiographical self, requires language to hold it together. Without language, there's no story to tell. Without a story, there's no narrator to tell it. And without a narrator, there's no one to serve as the subject of that memory. You can't hold on to the thought, "I was there," if you don't yet possess a stable, language-based concept of I in the first place. Cross-cultural research backs this up. Children who acquire language later in development also tend to develop autobiographical memory later. Bilingual children frequently recall their earliest memories most clearly in whichever language they were actually using at the time, even if they barely use that language as adults anymore. Children who learn sign language as their first language display the same pattern of early childhood amnesia as hearing children who learned spoken language, which suggests the key factor isn't spoken language specifically, but rather language as a broader cognitive system. Words aren't merely a tool for expressing a memory after the fact. They're actually part of how that memory gets constructed to begin with. So now we have 3 explanations that overlap and reinforce one another: an immature hippocampus, explosive neuron growth that disrupts stable memory formation, and the lack of language to structure autobiographical experience. All 3 of these are genuinely real, and they're happening at the same time. Together, they produce a period of nearly total memory loss, covering the most formative stretch of your entire life. But here's what makes this truly strange. Even though you can't remember those experiences, they still shaped who you became. This is the part people often overlook. Your infant years are missing from your conscious, retrievable memory. but they are absolutely not missing from you as a person. Everything that happened during those years left behind deep, structural imprints that continue to influence who you are today. The attachment patterns you formed with the people who cared for you during your first year of life, whether you learned that the world was a safe, responsive place or an unpredictable, unreliable one, got encoded not as memories you can recall, but as implicit expectations, habitual ways of being, emotional reflexes operating beneath your conscious awareness. If you were reliably soothed whenever you cried, your nervous system learned at a fundamentally biological level that discomfort passes and help is available. That learned expectation shapes how you handle stress as an adult, how quickly you're able to calm down, and how much faith you have that things will work out. On the other hand, if you were inconsistently comforted or sometimes left to cry without anyone responding, your nervous system absorbed a different lesson, not stored as a specific memory, but set as a kind of default calibration, a baseline sense of how safe the world is and how much you can depend on other people. None of this exists as a story you can consciously tell. You can't recall the specific night you cried and nobody came, or the particular morning you were held and felt entirely secure, but all of those individual moments accumulated into something larger, a stance toward existence that you carry with you without even realizing you're carrying it. This is exactly what psychologists mean when they distinguish implicit memory from explicit memory. Explicit memory is the kind you can consciously bring to mind and describe out loud. Implicit memory, by contrast, lives in your body, in your emotional reactions, and in the automatic assumptions you hold about relationships and whether you're worthy of care. Infantile amnesia wipes out your explicit memories completely, but it leaves your implicit memories fully intact. You lost the specific experiences, but you kept whatever lessons those experiences taught you. The trouble is, you can't examine lessons you don't even know you learned. You simply act them out and wonder afterward why you react to certain situations the way that you do. Now, let's talk about the fake ones, because this is where things get uncomfortable. Some of what you believe are your earliest memories are probably not genuine at all, not exaggerated or distorted, but actually manufactured, pieced together by your brain from photographs, family stories, and repeated retellings, then stored away as though they were authentic first-hand experiences. This phenomenon is very well documented in memory research, and confronting it directly can be genuinely disturbing. Here's how it typically happens. Suppose your family has a photo from your second birthday party. You've looked at that photo countless times growing up. Adults have told you the story surrounding that day, what happened, who was there, how you reacted to the cake. After hearing that story enough times, your brain eventually constructs a mental picture of the event. At some point, your brain files that constructed image alongside your actual memories. From then on, it feels exactly like a real memory. It carries the texture and quality of a memory. If asked, you'd describe it as one. But what you're really accessing is a reconstruction built out of information from other people, not a genuine trace of the actual original experience. Researchers have shown that entirely fabricated memories of events that never even happened can be planted in someone's mind through repeated suggestion combined with social reinforcement, and those invented memories feel, from the inside, completely indistinguishable from real ones. If false memories can be created this easily, it becomes even more plausible that genuine past experiences get reconstructed and mistakenly filed away as though they were direct, original memories. Take a moment to think about your own earliest memory, whichever one you'd reach for if someone asked you right now. Where did that memory actually come from? Did you always remember it on your own, without any prompting? Or did someone tell you the story first? Is there a photograph tied to it, or a family anecdote that gets repeated at gatherings? For most people, being honest about it, the answer is that they simply can't be certain. That uncertainty isn't comfortable to sit with, but it matters. Your memory of your own early life is, at least in part, a story that other people told about you, which you eventually absorbed and started treating as your own. This raises an odd philosophical question. If a memory feels vivid, emotionally genuine, and is functionally indistinguishable from a real memory in every way you're able to detect, does it actually matter whether it originated as a reconstruction? Some people would say no, that the memory serves its purpose regardless of where it came from. Others find the idea deeply unsettling, because it means the self you believe yourself to be is partly constructed out of stories about your own past. And if those stories were borrowed rather than actually remembered, what does that say about who you really are? There's no tidy resolution to that question, but it's worth sitting with regardless. Let's return to something a bit more concrete. Why do some people have earlier memories than others? Because clearly, they do. Research consistently shows real variation from person to person. Some people report what feel like authentic memories from as early as age 2. Others have nothing at all before age 5 or 6. On average, reliable autobiographical memory tends to begin somewhere around 3 to 3.5 years old, though the range across individuals is quite broad. Several factors appear to play a role here. Culture is one of them. Comparisons between American children and children from cultures where parents engage less often in collaborative reminiscing, meaning talking with kids about shared past events, asking them what they remember, and narrating family history back to them, show that this cultural habit of discussing memories together has a real effect on how early kids start forming lasting autobiographical memories. In cultures where parents routinely ask things like, "Do you remember when we went to the beach last summer? What did you see there?" Where memories are actively rehearsed and reinforced through conversation, children tend to develop earlier and richer memory abilities. This social practice of remembering together essentially teaches children that their own experiences are valuable enough to hold on to, while also giving them the narrative tools needed to do so. Memory, in other words, turns out to be partly a social skill, and like any social skill, it develops faster with practice and encouragement. Gender is another contributing factor, although the underlying reasons remain complicated. Research has found that, on average, women tend to report earlier and more emotionally rich childhood memories compared to men. Whether that difference comes from biology, from differences in how boys and girls are socialized around emotional expression and storytelling, or from some mix of both, remains an open question among researchers. And then there's stress to consider. Particularly frightening or emotionally intense experiences sometimes leave behind traces that ordinary memories don't. The amygdala, which functions as the brain's alarm system for emotion, becomes active and operational much earlier in development than the hippocampus does. Because of this, fear responses and intense emotional moments can sometimes leave behind residue that surfaces later on as feelings or physical reactions, without any accompanying story or narrative memory attached to them. You might find yourself inexplicably anxious inside a hospital, or feel an unexplainable sense of comfort at the smell of a particular food, without having any idea why. In cases like this, the emotion held onto the experience even though the story itself never survived. There's another piece of this that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, and that's sleep. Memory consolidation, the process by which fresh experiences get converted into stable, long-term memories, happens mainly while you're asleep. This occurs specifically during slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, when the brain effectively replays and reorganizes the events of the day, reinforcing important connections while trimming away the unnecessary ones. Infants sleep an enormous amount. A newborn sleeps somewhere between 16 and 18 hours a day, and the actual structure of that sleep looks completely different from adult sleep. Babies spend a much larger proportion of their sleep time in active, REM-like states compared to adults. For a long time, researchers simply assumed this was just a quirky feature of early development, with no particular significance for memory formation. It now appears that assumption may have been mistaken. Some researchers currently believe that all that active sleep during infancy actually serves a very specific developmental purpose. Rather than storing individual, discrete memories, it's consolidating the foundational patterns that make learning itself possible. Things like how faces work, how voices sound, how physical objects behave in space, and how social interaction generally unfolds. So an infant sleeping 18 hours a day isn't wasting time at all. That infant is building the underlying operating system that everything else in their life will eventually run on top of. It's not about saving individual files, it's about installing the software itself. One implication of this idea is that the experiences happening during those waking hours aren't being stored as memories precisely because they're being put to a more fundamental use. They're being converted into architecture rather than narrative, into raw capability rather than a story. You don't remember learning how to see, yet you can see perfectly well. You don't remember learning that objects are solid and continue to exist even when out of view, Yet you know this instantly and effortlessly at every moment of your life. You don't remember learning to read emotional cues in faces and voices, yet you do exactly that, automatically, thousands of times every single day, without conscious effort. All of that was learned during the very years you're unable to recall. It simply got stored in a completely different format than the kind of memories you're able to access now. One that's deeper, more permanent, and more foundational. So what does all of this actually mean for you, personally, right now? It means the earliest years of your life weren't wasted just because you can't remember them today. In many respects, they were the single most consequential years of your entire existence. The years when the fundamental architecture of who you are got laid down at a level far deeper than memory could ever reach. Who you are as a person, how you attach to others, how you respond to uncertainty, the things that soothe you, and the things that unsettle you, along with the instincts you can't quite explain and the fears that seem to come out of nowhere, all of it has roots stretching back into a period of your life that remains completely invisible to your conscious mind. You are, in a very real sense, built out of experiences you have no ability to access. Depending on how you look at it, that fact is either unsettling or freeing. On the unsettling side, you can't go back and inspect the foundation. There's no way to audit those first 3 years to figure out exactly why you turned out the way you did. Those early influences are genuinely real. They're shaping you all the time, and they remain completely outside your conscious reach. On the freeing side, though, the lack of an explicit memory also means the lack of an explicit narrative. You don't carry around a fixed story. You tell yourself about those years, which means that story isn't set in stone. The implicit patterns can still be altered. Not through remembering, since there's nothing there to remember, but through new experiences that update those old, outdated calibrations. Things like therapy, safe and stable relationships, and consistent new evidence proving that the world isn't the same place your 3-month-old self concluded it was. The brain remains adaptable throughout life. Those early patterns carry real influence, but they don't determine your destiny. They're simply your starting point. And here's one final thing worth thinking about. Every single generation gets shaped by experiences none of them can consciously remember, passed down from caregivers who themselves were shaped by experiences they couldn't remember either. This implicit emotional inheritance travels through families across generations. Things like anxiety patterns, attachment styles, and baseline assumptions about whether the world is a safe place, all transmitted without anyone being able to point to where it originally came from or consciously choose whether to pass it forward. You inherited something from the people who raised you, something that came from the people who raised them. Not passed down as stories, and not taught explicitly, but transmitted as calibration, as the emotional atmosphere you were breathing in during your earliest years, long before you had any awareness that you were even absorbing it. The specific memories themselves are gone, but what those experiences built is still sitting inside you right now, quietly running the show in ways you barely even notice. The first years of your life genuinely happened, and they mattered more than almost any of the years that came afterward. You simply weren't permitted to hold on to the